Good evening and welcome to Southern Oregon Climate Action Now's program, which is today co-sponsored by the Siskiyous chapter of the Native Plant Society of Oregon. And we might be joined by some of the folks from the Native Plant Society of Oregon Siskiyous chapter as we go through the program. This program was suggested to us by Christy Mergenthaler, who's with the Native Plant Society Siskiyous chapter. And it's a great delight for us to be welcoming Susan Harrison from UC Davis to do a presentation, but we'll get to that in just a minute. First off, let me introduce the co-facilitator along with me of SOCAN, sitting on my left, Kathy Conway, who will be talking with you much more a bit later on. A few little notes for you to help you through the program. Please mute yourself now and stay muted during the program. We will be having a Q&A moment at the end of Susan's presentation. But what we would like you to do is write your questions into the chat, which is at the bottom of your screen. Click on the chat button and it'll open. Type your questions in and then click return and they will be submitted. And then when we get to the Q&A, Kathy, I think, is going to be the one who goes through the questions and reads them so Susan can focus on doing her presentation and doesn't have to keep looking at the chat to see if anybody's asking questions. As you will have heard, the presentation is being recorded and then it will be posted on our website on our YouTube page. So folks who are missing the program can catch up with it a bit later on. Okay. Liz.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. As a member of the board of directors, I'd like to say that in the year ahead, we are planning to explore the practice of land acknowledgements so that we can be more authentic and intentional and accountable in showing our respect. And so for tonight, I will simply say that we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land most of us are on today, the Takelma, Shasta, Klamath, and Modoc, and we pay our respect to their elders past, present, and emerging.
Okay, a quick note about the meeting format, and it does follow the standard format that we have for our programs, and that is we start with, of course, our little introduction, which is what's happening now. Then we focus on the presentation for some 35 minutes or so. That's followed by a Q&A period, and that will last about 10 to 15 minutes. And then the last 10 minutes or so, Kathy will entertain you with a summary of what SOCAN is doing and what other groups in the area focusing on climate issues are doing. And Susan has agreed to stay with us. So if anybody has questions that we don't get to during the Q&A period, you can, we'll go a little more informal after 7 o'clock and we'll invite you to ask your questions and engage in conversation with Susan at that time. So let me introduce our speaker. Oh, sorry, I should say links are available during the course of the presentation. Susan will be referring to items and you won't be able to copy down the URL for those as she's talking, but on our website, we have a socan.eco/action page, and that's where you can find information that Susan talks about and actions that might be relevant to the program that Susan is giving us this evening. So under collective, go to socan.action/action, go to collective action, select natural resources, and you'll find an abbreviated title of this evening's presentation, Forest Understory Plant Communities. So let me introduce Susan. Dr. Susan Harrison is a professor of ecology at the University of California, Davis. She works on the dynamics of natural populations and ecological diversity. She's a fellow of the Ecological Society of America and the California Academy of Sciences. She is chair of the Department of Environmental Science and Policy and has been conducting research for many years on the distribution of understory plant species in the Siskiyous along the California-Oregon border. This will be the topic of her conversation with us this evening.
All right, thank you, Alan. Pull up my slideshow here. Is my slideshow appearing okay?
Perfect.
Yeah, thanks for your kind introduction. And I have to issue a disclaimer that as an academic, all I put under action items are a list of academic journal articles for you to read. So in my world, that's what action is. But maybe with the help of all you folks on the call tonight, you can populate that portion of the website with some actual three-dimensional in real life actions too. That would be great. Thanks again for inviting me. It's always fun to talk to a group of people who are environmentally keen, interested, and aware in this wonderful part of the world. I spend, just biographically speaking, I spend part of my time in Ashland. My husband and I have a place there, and we're very enamored of Southern Oregon, and just don't happen to be there right now, but we do go there a lot. Spend a lot of quality time exploring all the wonderful trails and wonderful undiscovered or less known corners of the region, which is just a real joy. So Alan already told you my talk title, and the story that I'll focus on tonight began for me as a researcher in about the year that this paper came out, actually a year or two before this paper came out in 2007. And I know all of you are very well aware of climate change ecology and ecological effects of climate change. So I think you might share my feeling of slight nostalgia, if you want to put it that way, for the era when this science paper was published. Because what this paper reports is that in 2007, for the first time, the world scientific community has decided, yes, there is evidence of climate change. Natural communities, we can detect the effects of climate change on natural communities. So this is reporting that firm conclusion has been reached in the latest edition of the IPCC report. And to look back at that today, as we look at our burning hillsides and our mega droughts and mega floods in other parts of the world and so on, seems kind of quaint, doesn't it? A lot has happened in only 15 years. But at this time, it was just coming on the screen that there are not just some isolated studies that claim to find climate change effects, but yes, the effects are here. They're detectable, folks. That was the message of this short article. So where my friend and research collaborator, Ellen Damshin, who's now at University of Wisconsin, and I jumped in, was with the question that you see on this slide. Given that we know that climate change is happening in some form everywhere, and globally it can have many different effects because the type and the magnitude, the exact nature of climate change is so variable, there's another piece of the puzzle that we didn't think had been explored very much, which is if we look within a landscape or within a region where climate change is doing some particular thing, it's hotter and it's wetter, or it's hotter or drier, whatever it is, what about different plant communities? What about different vegetation types might render them more vulnerable or less vulnerable, or cause some plant communities to change in one direction and others in another? And so I sort of like this picture to illustrate this. This is a UC natural reserve in Santa Barbara County. But what you see in this one glorious picture are about 3 or 4 distinct plant community types, from very disturbed agricultural and grazing lands to oak woodland and chaparral to higher elevation with a little bit of conifer forest. And that's kind of almost the same spectrum of community types that we examined in our study, with the goal of seeing, can we develop and test any predictions about what makes different plant communities respond to the same climatic shift in a particular way. And to undertake that, I'll be mostly talking about work that's now been done and published for 10 years, but I will be talking later on in this talk about some newer little add-ons to the study, okay? But what we did, the heart of our study, was to follow in the footsteps of this guy who came to the Illinois Valley in 1949 to 51 with the intent of sampling as many plant communities as he could, for reasons I'll tell you about in a minute. He spent 3 summers there and collected plant community samples, little plots of plant community data from about 400 locations all around the Klamath-Siskiyou region, but mainly centered in the area from about Selma to Cave Junction out to Caves Monument and the mountains around that. Robert Whitaker published his work on this particular study in 1960 in Ecological Monographs, this 60-page paper that you see quoted here. So before I tell you what we were up to, let me just tell you in recent times, let me tell you just very briefly what he was up to. So here's sort of his study ambit that I just described. The yellow flags are his sites on serpentine soils, of which more soon. And his blue flags are some of his sites on non-serpentine soils, which are centered around Caves Monument. And he deliberately designed his distribution of sampling locations to encompass gradients of topography, elevation, and soil. To a lesser extent, he sort of strung them along a coast to interior gradient, because he was interested in two things. He was interested in how climate shapes plant communities, but also his other big interest, as expressed in this big monograph, was how do we classify and kind of technically describe plant communities? Because in his earlier work in the 40s, late 40s, his PhD work, in fact, he strongly supported with his PhD work the point of view you see in the bottom of these two panels, which is to say that what we call plant communities are not these real entities, these clusters of species that exist out there that always encompass the same set of species. He was much more the point of view that every species is distributed in the environment in ways that suit its particular needs. And so what we call communities are kind of human labels of convenience for species that just happen to occur together a lot. And so if you, in his work, he said, if you sampled the distributions of different species along some gradient like elevation, what you wouldn't find is something like the top graph here, where each curve represents a species changing in abundance along that gradient. The top graph, cartoon graph, illustrates a community where all the species are packaged into very distinct communities. The bottom graph is what he found, which he argued was generally true. Every species behaving in its own particular way along an environmental gradient. So his work really established that. It was a very controversial point at the time, and his work really reinforced that second viewpoint, the individualistic viewpoint as it became called. And so his next step as a young assistant professor based at Washington State University in Pullman was to come out here to what he knew was a very diverse, complex system of plant communities, but also one that had lots of identifiable environmental gradients like the ones you just heard about, topography, soils, elevation, to develop sampling techniques and statistical techniques to classify communities as best we can, with the idea that climate is the thing that ultimately organizes them. So that's in a very brief nutshell what this guy was up to. And he became a very eminent ecologist later in his career. He ended up at Cornell and lots of honors and recognition, and probably made about 4 or 5 major contributions to 20th century ecology before unfortunately dying rather young, age 60 in 1980. So what we did was go back to his sites and try to resample them. And we know that after Whitaker was here in 1951, and before we showed up in about 2006, a number of changes had happened to this region. And one of which is an awful lot of clear-cut logging that occurred after World War II to satisfy the demand for lots and lots of lumber for post-war building and such. But the other thing that's happened, of course, is that the climate has changed. And these are data from weather stations fairly close to the study site. So these record what's going on in this region pretty accurately. And you can see a few things. There hasn't been overall directional change in precipitation on the lower right, but of course, temperature on the lower left, although it's fluctuated a lot, has increased. And on the upper right, snowpack has decreased, not because there's less precipitation, but because less of it falls as snow, which has pretty big implications for hydrology, water storage, fish, and all the rest. And this is pretty typical of a lot of the American West. And when we start thinking about, well, what types of changes should we expect in plant communities? I think it's really important to recognize that plants don't deal with temperature and water individually. They deal with them together. A big effect of temperature on plants is to increase their water demand. And this can be expressed by various so-called bioclimatic variables. that rather than taking temperature and precipitation as two different things, integrate them into a measure of plant water availability during the growing season. There's a whole number of different variables depending on your exact purposes. But this graph shows one that's called the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which is just a modeled approximation of how much water is in the deeper soil and in the shallower soil. And in this 2015 paper, the authors projected that backwards in time using tree ring data. In the 20th century, of course, they can calibrate that tree ring data with actual climate data. And they can also take the climate parameters and feed them into climate prediction models to say, where have we been in the past with essentially variability in severity of drought? Where are we now? What's the variability like? And then and how severe is the future drought going to be compared to some of the extreme ones that we've had recently? And what you can see from this is that where we were in about 2015, this is published before our current drought, but where we actually were in about 2015 is easily could be called a 1,000-year drought, and yet it's not as severe as what every year might be like in another 100 years. So that's the kind of the scary message from analyses like this. But at any rate, this is just to say that to a good first approximation, from a plant's perspective, we could think about this as a climate that is becoming drier for plants. Water availability for plants is going to be lower at critical times of year. So our adventure, that mainly the big first part of it unfolded from about 2007 to 2010, and then we came back for some follow-up things that I'll tell you about. But in 2008, summer of 2007 and 2008, 2009, Ellen, who's on the left here, and I, in my little green Toyota 4Runner that I used to have, wandered around this region, trying our best to resample as many as possible of the approximate localities where Whitaker had collected his data some, half century-ish before. The other fellow there is Tom Wentworth, who was a professor of Ellen's when she was a grad student, also a contemporary of Whitaker. In fact, he had been a student of Whitaker, and he was helping us suss out kind of Whitaker's methodology, how he looked at things, what kinds of sites he would have chosen for his sampling, and that sort of stuff. So we had 3 specific questions based on our kind of general interests. First, drawing on a general climate change literature that says alpine mountaintops are going to be like the canaries in the coal mine, we predicted, or we asked, whether high elevation communities, such as the 5,000 to 7,000 foot range in our region, experience greater sensitivity to climate change, to a given amount of climate change, compared to lower elevation forests, which would be maybe in the 1,200 to 4,000 foot range. Just kind of based on the general expectation that the higher you go in elevation, the more that temperature per se becomes a big control on climate, and so that could be an extra sensitive set of communities. And that's backed up by there's been a lot of research on climate change ecology in the Swiss Alps, tons of papers coming out of that. Okay, I'm gonna keep my phone going here so I can keep an eye on my timer. Oh, I forgot to start my timer. Oh, well, so much for that great idea. Just wave your hands at me if I'm starting to run over time. I think I'll do okay. Another question we asked was, are more disturbed plant communities, ones that have been more disturbed by humans, that is, more sensitive, more vulnerable than less disturbed ones? And again, this kind of draws on very general ideas from ecology, and especially climate change ecology, about how sort of all these disturbances can interact to amplify each other. In the case of forests, people often talk about how forest fragmentation will make it harder for natural communities to be resilient to climate change by making it harder for species to shift their distributions. That's what's illustrated in this little thought paper that I've clipped some art from here. So we thought that, well, maybe our logged forests at low elevation would be more vulnerable, more sensitive than our primary forests, the ones that had not been logged after Whitaker's time and before ours. And then the third question was, these communities on really harsh, infertile soils, specifically serpentine, which is very abundant in the southern Oregon region, we thought that these might show less sensitivity to climate, to a given amount of climate change, compared to the normal plant communities on nearby normal soils. And This is, I'm sure, a less familiar idea to you folks than the previous two ideas that I talked about. So I'll take a couple more minutes to explain this idea. First of all, one of the best reasons to hypothesize that is work that was done in your very own region up in the kind of Red Buttes area of the Klamath-Siskiyous by Christy Briles, who was then a graduate student. She collected fossil pollen cores from several lakes in some on serpentine soils and some on granite soils in the high elevation Klamath Mountains. And one of her conclusions is that if you look back over the past 10,000 or so years since the last ice age, of course, you see fluctuations in forest communities composition over time as the climate changes, but those fluctuations are more muted on serpentine soils, seeming to bear out this idea of low sensitivity. My various students and other collaborators and I have done a number of experiments, mostly on grassland communities in California, where we've imposed treatments like watering or drought shelters, combined with other things like fertilization and mowing and various other treatments on communities, on plant communities, on harsh, infertile serpentine soils and kind of normal, more fertile soils. And this little graph here shows you a typical finding that if you just water a harsh serpentine community like the one you see in this picture, it doesn't change very much because it's so nutrient limited that it just doesn't respond to changing the water supply. However, if you add nutrients, it increases the sensitivity of the community to water. So there's a synergistic effect. But in the absence of the added nutrients, the serpentine communities don't change very much in response to simulated climate. And then a third source of evidence is a huge geographic survey that my students and I did of paired serpentine and non-serpentine communities all the way across California, across about a 10-fold range of variation in annual rainfall. Dry communities in the south and east, wet ones in the north and west. And what you see is kind of schematically illustrated here in terms of the kinds of plants you find. If you look at the non-serpentine plant communities, you notice that in the south, where it's dry, they've got small, tough, leathery leaves. And in the north, where it's nice and wet, they got the big, broad, thin, fast-growing kind of leaf. That's what normal plant communities do when along a gradient of drier to wetter climate. But if you look at the serpentine plant communities, again, just schematic here, they don't change very much. They're small, tough, thick, leathery leaves, regardless of the climate. So what this all adds up to, and the ultimate basis for our prediction, this is just something that's been of interest to my lab now for 15, 20 years, is that you can characterize plants in terms of what are called functional traits, these attributes of their morphology and physiology that reflect how they get resources. And you can use that as a way to analyze kind of the ecological functioning of a community. And one of the biggest, broadest axes of variation that separates different species is the variation from these tough, stress-tolerant species to these fast-growing species that have bigger, thinner, more protein-rich, more chlorophyll-rich leaves. And on serpentine and other harsh, you tend to find the more stress-tolerant types of species. They benefit from being able to handle crappy soils and low water supply. They lose out on the ability to grow fast if resources are abundant. But what this does is potentially kind of gives them a little bit of pre-adaptation almost to climatic stress. They're always ready to handle a really crummy situation. And so we might expect to see just less responsiveness to a hotter, drier climate or just a random dry year in terms of climate. So we have we've built up a fair amount of evidence from different sources to suggest that this hypothesis is true, which would be kind of cool for this region because serpentine plants are one of the biggest sources of cool endemic plants in the Klamath-Siskiyou region that everybody loves, that are very special because they're found nowhere else, and you have whole NPSO field trips to go see them. It would be nice to think that they're a little more climate resistant than maybe some other plant communities. Okay, so I'll gotta skip through some of these slides. So I'll just quickly say that Ellen and I took, in days before I had much less gray hair, went off to Cornell and dug Robert Whitaker's data out of the archives. That's what we're doing here. And then we came to the Illinois Valley area and relocated as best we could over 200 of his sites. And this was approximate relocation because we didn't have maps, we didn't have GPS points. What we had was a descriptor like you see on this slide. Site 268, it's on serpentine soil, it's along Weimer Road. We have the elevation, the slope, and the aspect. And so we just go out and find a site that fits that description as closely as possible and that is undisturbed. It doesn't have logging, fire, parking lots or anything else disturbing it. And we just go out and sample as many sites as possible that fit as closely as possible those location descriptors of Whitaker's. So, and then what we do when we get there is we lay out a big plot and we focus on herb species percent cover. So that's what we're doing here. I won't bother explaining the exact technique, except to say that it was pretty reliably repeatable among observers. So we feel pretty good about the technique. So we know which species are in each plot and what percent cover they had. And we sampled a little over 50 each of low elevation forests that were not logged, not burned. That's kind of like our basic forest type. We sample, and those are low elevation. We sampled about the same number of low elevation sites on serpentine, where it's a much more open woodland, Jeffrey pine, incense cedar, and a lot of open ground. We also sampled 40 sites that were the low elevation forest. This is with, I should have said, this is with like Douglas fir as one of the dominant species and a mixture of other conifers. And so we sampled about 40 sites that were in second growth condition on Little Grayback Road, about 20 to 40-year-old forest. That was our disturbed forest type. And then we sampled about 70 of these gorgeous high elevation forests around the Caves Monument area, where you have it's elevations where you have a snowpack and you have red fir, white fir, and mountain hemlock as some of the dominant species. Each of those sets of sites each of those types of sites, I should say, spans a range from cool north-facing slopes to hot south-facing slopes, which is a gradient that was very important in Whitaker's thinking. He called it the topographic moisture gradient, illustrated here by cool, wet, north-facing slopes on the left and hot, dry, south-facing slopes on the right. And so our predictions were, we're going to see some sort of negative change related to a drier climate in our basic low elevation forests. So that's that little minus sign. We're not going to see that in the serpentine, so there's a little 0. But we're going to see even stronger changes, kind of stronger negative changes in the disturbed forest and at the high elevations. Those were our predictions, just kind of based on a priori what we knew when we started out in the study. What did we measure? Well, that's a tricky question because we couldn't look at any one particular species because there were so many species and most of them are not very common. So we had to develop kind of collective measures of something that's now called thermophilization, shifting a plant community till it's more characteristic of a hot, dry climate. So that's what we were trying to develop, is ways to measure that. We came up with 3 measures, and I'll just touch on them really fast. One is a shift such that any particular community at a particular place now looks a little bit more like a hot, dry, south-facing slope and a little bit less like a cool, north-facing slope than it did 50 years ago. So a shift in species composition that makes a site at any one place look more like a hot, south-facing slope. And we do that just by statistical analysis of species composition patterns. Second thing is using biogeographic information. We can divide our species. These are all understory herbs, dividing them into ones that are of northerly or southerly biogeographic origin using this classic monograph by Raven and Axelrod. So of course, we predict greater declines in species from the northern biogeographic origins because they're more moisture-loving species. And finally, using this functional trait idea, we expect a shift in the community so that high species with large, thin leaves, which are called high specific leaf area species, are going to decline. Species with small, thick, leathery leaves, low specific leaf area, are going to not decline so much. And so we're going to see a shift in the average species, specific leaf area of the community, which is just one way to measure how the plant community composition has changed. We're not saying that individual species have evolved or changed. We're saying that the community has shifted from one type of species towards another type of species. Okay, very briefly again, our results were that we saw all of the changes that we predicted in the low elevation communities. Every low elevation community, the unlogged, the logged, and the serpentine, showed at least 2, or in some cases 3, of our predicted changes. We couldn't say that of the 3 low elevation communities, we couldn't say that any one had changed more or less than the other 2. It just kind of depends on which metric you use. So I was glad we used all 3 metrics. But one of the big surprises was that we didn't see any of our predicted changes at high elevations. In fact, in one respect, our high elevation sites shifted in the opposite direction. They shifted towards a slightly higher prevalence of the species with the northerly biogeographic origins compared to 50 years ago. So that was a little surprise. Several of our results were surprises. I'll just very quickly say, and you can feel free to ask me about this later, but we considered deeply as we could, put a lot of effort into considering other possible causes of ecological change over this time. And I think I can say with confidence that the results I just told you are relatively free of the influences of any other causes of ecological change, but I'm happy to discuss that. But the surprise was that if those were our predictions, these are our results. So we did not have a very successful time of predicting relative sensitivity of different plant community types. So then the fun part became, well, can we, in retrospect, 2020 hindsight, now that we know these communities better, and we know the climate change literature is evolving very fast, can we go back and explain those surprising aspects of our results? And so over time, developed this idea to explain why we had not seen sort of climate resistance in the serpentine plant communities. Other researchers have noticed that forest overstory, shading from trees, plays a big role in buffering understory temperatures. And so you would expect more climate stress and more change in an open woodland than you would in a closed, shady forest. Well, serpentine sites just happen to be open woodlands without so much shade. So that seemed like an interesting possibility that maybe the plant community is more resistant to climate change. But working against that is it's more exposed to climate change because of the lack of shade. So we found evidence for that just by playing around with statistics, showing that indeed the amount of change in the plant communities on serpentine is a function of how shady they are. And what this graph says statistically is, if you could make all serpentine communities in our data as shady as the average non-serpentine site, they actually wouldn't have changed at all. So you could say that statistically speaking, it is the greater solar exposure of those serpentine understories that counteracted what otherwise would have been a tendency to change less. So yeah, I was kind of happy about that. I hope this isn't too confusing, and I'm happy to go back and discuss any of it. Why the high elevation communities confounded our expectations by seemingly being better off than the low elevation communities, I think makes actually a lot of sense in hindsight. When you have environments where snowpack is a regular annual occurrence and the climate gets warmer and suddenly there's less snowpack, initially at least, that's going to lead to a longer, warmer growing season, a longer season when temperature and water are available for plants to grow. And so at least in the short term, plant communities might become more productive, more favorable for plant growth. And that could change in the longer term, of course, when there's just not enough snowpack to keep the soil moist throughout the summer. But we found by looking at other literature, this was a really cool paper that came out in 2012, that indeed other people have found the same thing. This is a study of change in mountaintop communities in Europe. And they basically found opposite changes in mountaintops in cold, snowy northern Europe and mountaintops in hot, dry southerly Europe that I think fit pretty well with the type of explanation that I just described. Making the climate warmer is kind of a nice thing to do for plants in a cold climate, and it's not such a nice thing to do for plants in a dry, water-limited climate. And when you cross in the Siskiyous, when you cross that boundary from forests that don't have a big snowpack to ones that do, it's kind of like you're going from Southern Europe to Northern Europe over a short distance, and getting potentially opposite or at least very differing effects of the same amount of warming in the climate. Another kind of really fun follow-up study was done by my former postdoc, Marko Spasojevic, who's now on the faculty of UC Riverside. And he addressed a question that, of course, we really wanted to understand better. What ecological processes cause these plant community changes? And in a nutshell, he transplanted seeds of 3 species of serpentine endemics from low elevations in the Siskiyous up to high elevations, and also to cool northerly slopes and warmer south-facing slopes. And of these 3 species, 2 of them, the 2 that you see in these graphs, a Phacelia species and a Horkelia species, actually only survived when they were transplanted to much cooler sites than the ones where they grow now. They only grow up to maybe a few thousand feet, and they survived a lot better at 4,000 feet, and they survived a lot better on north slopes than on south slopes. So this suggests the existence of a pretty big dispersal lag. Species are actually not getting to the new locations where they could be doing better. And that seemed to be pretty strongly indicated by his results. And it also suggests that, not surprisingly, the most vulnerable life stage for plants is typically the seedling, when they germinate, and then they've got to get their little tiny root system down. They got to get through their first summer, get their root down deep enough to get some water. And that's the exact stage where Marko's results emerged, so to speak. So seedling mortality could well be the process that caused the plant community changes that we saw in our Whitaker reanalysis study. And so one last thing, a last follow-up. The last time that I came and sampled plants in the Siskiyous was in 2015, when we were having this really big 1,000-year drought that I mentioned earlier, and wanted to know if this extreme drought that was being called a 1,000-year drought or an unprecedented drought was having ecologically extreme effects that we could detect. And by extreme, I mean that if you look at some variable that describes a plant community, you look at how that changes from, say, wetter years to drier years, or wetter locations to drier locations. That line, that slanting line in the graph, kind of represents, let's say, biomass. It's high in wet years, it's lower in dry years. But when we see this mega drought of 2012 to 2015, is that just another point along that same line? Or is it like this red dot down below? It's so extreme that it's kind of off the regression. It's off the line. It's like a phase shift, or a kind of one of these threshold tipping point type of phenomena that people talk about a lot with respect to climate change. So my little gang of collaborators and I actually went back and resampled 4 big studies that we had done over the years: the geographic gradient of several hundred sites across California, and a water manipulation experiment in California grasslands, a long-term, like a 20-year plant monitoring project in California grasslands, and then this study of Whitaker's sites in Oregon that I just told you about. We actually went and collected hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sites worth of data in 1 year to see if we could detect these kinds of extreme changes caused by the big severe drought. I put this little rock down here to remind me to say that all 4 of these studies had nested within them the comparison of serpentine soils and non-serpentine soils, because we're always curious about that. And all this work, it was a tremendous amount of work. It's a really massive campaign of a project. We analyzed massive numbers of variables for massive numbers of sites, and we came out to one extreme result of the drought, which is with respect to exotic annual grass cover. You don't have this as much in Oregon, although you do have some, but we have a ton of it in California. Hillsides that are just the dominant vegetation is exotic annual grass. And in 2 of our 4 studies, we found that the reduction in biomass of exotic annual grass during the drought was extreme. It was off the regression line. It was like a much more severe response than just kind of a normal dry year type of response. But we didn't see anything in Oregon. We didn't really detect any drought effects in our resampling of Whitaker's sites. I am very close to done, I promise. I have been trying to monitor the time, even though I set my stopwatch and then forgot to turn it on. I've been thinking time, so I only have a couple more slides here. I want to say that we were not able to include trees in our Whitaker project because it just turned out that the way that we encountered Whitaker's data when we dug it out of the archives at Cornell was in an aggregated form where we couldn't go back and find data for his individual sites. So we couldn't do any analyses of what happened to trees over the last 50 years. But luckily, just last year, another set of authors has done a really similar study to ours and very much focusing on trees. And this is Eric Jules and colleagues going back and resampling some plots that were sampled by folks at Humboldt State in 1969 in the Russian wilderness area of the Klamath Mountains. And there were 148 plots. These lucky folks had maps, unlike us. So the map here shows the actual sampling locations. The graph on the lower right shows that indeed there's been warming and drying of the climate during the intervening years. And these folks had really nice data on 12 tree species by age class. So you can say, over this time period, what happened to adult trees? What happened to seedlings? What happened to saplings? And they just published this. And so it's exactly what we would have liked to done if Whitaker's data had allowed us to do that. And they basically found, to cut a long story short, that white fir has increased, but most other species have decreased. Most species have shifted upward in elevation as predicted under climate change, but not nearly as much as their climatic niche has shifted upwards. So again, a dispersal lag. Species are moving, but not fast enough to keep pace with climate change. And they speculate that fire suppression, by keeping the understory dense and closed by overstory, has created conditions that make it hard for species to move upslope and because there's a shaded understory, it's hard for drought adapted species to kind of move in and take over, as they should be doing if the climate is getting drier. So the fire suppression may be contributing to decreased forest resilience. So to recap, what I've tried to show in the last busy half hour is that ours is one of now many studies that have shown that when you have a semi-arid environment where rainfall is generally limiting, and you add climatic warming on top of that, you can get this effect that people have called thermophilization, a shift of, in this case, forest understories toward a more drought adapted set of species and a relative loss of drought intolerant species. And a lot of this could be because of recruitment failure. Like an adult plant could survive, but it can't reproduce. It can't get seedlings into the next generation. Also, big focus of our study was how big is this change in different communities? And somewhat contrary to our expectations, we didn't necessarily find that temperature limited high elevation communities are the most sensitive ones. We also didn't find that these logged forests showed qualitatively different or worse changes than the unlogged forests. And we did, I think, sort of, in the end, support this body of other literature that suggests that when you have a plant community on really harsh nutrient limited soils, that they're a bit less sensitive to a drying climate. So those were some of the novel contributions of our study to the larger field of climate change ecology. And my final conclusion is, so what? By which I specifically mean that in the last 10 years, and even more so in the last 5 years, there's been a game changer, right? I mean, the way that we're looking now at climate change and its effects are going to play out in terms of short and long-term ecological change. You know, our thinking is now dominated 100% by fire, or at least 95% by fire. And the idea of these small gradual changes over time just doesn't seem as relevant when you have these unprecedentedly kind of massive fire events, combined with other massive events around the world of mega droughts and mega floods and so on. But in this part of the world, of course, increasingly, it's becoming all about fire. And so if I were to set out now to say, what are going to be the climate change effects of the, the present and the future, I would be asking questions, like this. When you have increasingly large fires, increasingly severe fires, fires at short intervals following other fires, where there's not time necessarily for seed regeneration, or fires that are followed by droughts, so that crucial window for seed regeneration is lost because it's too dry during the window for recruitment, what's going to come back? And to what extent will forests be resilient in the sense of the pre-existing species? To what extent will forests be resilient in the sense of being able to transition to at least other kind of native dominated community types? And those, I think, are the big questions now, the big questions of the future for my field. And I just leave you here with one example of, it's just kind of a random study that I found when searching on Klamath forest ecology climate change, but it's a study in which people are using a combination of field data and modeling to say, when we have these fires, where within these fires do we expect enough seedling recruitment to bring back the pre-existing forest, and in what parts of the fire, either because of dry conditions or because the fire is so big and it burned all the seed sources, will we not get enough seedlings to regenerate a stand of the pre-existing forest? And also just want to leave you with a little reminder at the bottom of the slide here that paleontologists tell us that, 8 to 10,000 years ago, when we had a very warm, dry period following the last ice age, the forests that are now dominated by white fir and Douglas fir were dominated by a different set of species, like western white pine, sugar pine, white oak, and incense cedar, which in part are species that are better able to tolerate frequent fire. So if we're lucky, what future decades might bring is some of those species moving in, some ecological change similar to what happened 8,000 years ago. But of course, a big question is how fast can that happen how fast can that regeneration happen, and that those transitions happen relative to how fast the climate is changing. And so I will just leave you with that as what I think are the big open questions for the future. And as mentioned earlier on, these are the papers that I referenced in this talk, and you can find them on the SOCAN website in the location that Alan pointed you to earlier. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Susan. I'll start with the questions in the chat, and if they bring any questions to mind for anybody, if you would add your questions to the chat, that would be helpful. The first one is from Lance, and he says, do you think plant communities that have evolved with disturbance, i.e. flooding, like those diverse communities within a riparian forest, will have more resiliency as climate change progresses?
Yeah, I haven't really thought as much about the riparian systems, but I think it's generally true. I think we've all sort of seen this, that in terms of ecological restoration, where there's water there, it works, right? Plant communities always come back if there's water. And so a riparian forest can be heavily disturbed and it can regrow pretty well. Whereas a sort of a dry upland community can be heavily disturbed and not come back so well. So yeah, I mean, I do think that's true as long as the water is there. If the climate change takes away the water, then I wouldn't, put much money on it. But I think when water is present, it's amazing how resilient forests can be, or other vegetation types.
Thank you. From Travis, would a plant from a serpentine community retain its relatively high resistance to changes in climate if transported to a non-serpentine community?
Yeah, that's something we've been really curious about too. And the whole question underlying that of, when you see plants that only grow on serpentine, is that because they just love crappy soils and rocks with low nutrients and other strange chemical constituents? Or is it just a refuge from competition, and these plants would do perfectly well on a more fertile soil if they didn't have competitors? And so, yeah, I mean, one possibility would be that in some future drier world where the surrounding vegetation isn't as dense and there's not as much competition, that some things that are maybe not strict serpentine endemics, some of the kinds of plants that you find much more on serpentine than off, maybe they will broaden their distribution onto other soils. But yeah, I mean, I believe that the resistance, such as it is, comes from the intrinsic traits of the plants. It's not, yeah, so it comes from things like being a perennial that holds on to its leaves a long time and is, effectively evergreen rather than deciduous. Those are the kinds of traits that make plants able to tolerate nutrient scarce conditions. And those traits, I don't think, would change that much just through transplanting to a new environment. So yeah, I think that quite possibly they would. And maybe that's a good place to look for your new landscaping is, go get some leather oaks and white leaf manzanita from Serpentine and plant them in your yard, because they'll be able to handle extreme xeriscape conditions.
It's interesting. People always ask us what they should be planting. So that's good to know. From Lonnie, how do you think people could aid in making sure plants survive and can be spread across the climates where they will survive, as a quick fix to climate change is currently unattainable? How could it be done without disturbing the plant communities too negatively?
Yeah, great question. I think everybody who thinks about that subject of assisted migration, one conclusion that you can readily come to is there's almost no way that we can affect species movement on the kind of scale that would be broadly effective at changing plant communities or changing survival. You could certainly take individual species and sort of protect them by moving them to safer locations in a very cultivated or curated kind of way. But the kinds of large scale intervention that, to kind of save plant communities or save species more broadly, I think would be just dauntingly, huge. However, I do think that the practice of ecological restoration is one that, people need to be, and they are, I'm sure, taking a serious look at how we think about restoration. Makes no sense to put back communities into an environment that's changing out from under them. And I think some of the ways that people are wrestling with that, given that you're going to do restoration anyway, why not do it as sort of an experiment and sort of an attempt to augment resilience in species? So one way to do that would be by using a mixture of genotypes, including genotypes from hotter climates. When you're putting back a native grassland, don't just get your material from the immediate vicinity, which is what people always have done, but maybe strategically look at more southerly sources or something like that, so that at least our restored communities might have some lasting value.
So Lonnie also went on, and this might be something you've responded to already. Do you think there would be difference in species composition if there were added nutrients and water to secondary and primary forests?
Well, I mean, depends what you mean, but we do have that experiment going on in a sense, especially in Europe. The amount of atmospheric nutrient deposition is huge. Nitrogen, from tailpipe emissions, mainly from industrial emissions, and to lesser extent, kind of emissions from agriculture. We have that here too, not so much in Southern Oregon, but in the Eastern US. But in Europe, it's really, really a big problem. Atmospheric nitrogen deposition is a huge problem. So we kind of know how it plays out. And I think the biggest effects aren't on forests; it's on these very special communities that are there because of scarce nutrients, like the heaths, for example, these kind of low shrublands, which are very important habitat for wildlife and rich in plant diversity. Heaths are there because of low nitrogen soil, and so with this atmospheric deposition, they just become grassy. So that's one area where I can sort of speak confidently what adding nitrogen on a large scale to terrestrial ecosystems can do. I don't know of evidence for what nitrogen deposition does in forests.
Alan has one, and I'll let him ask it rather than making him type it all in. So
okay,
it's a sort of a two-parter. Coincidentally, I was teaching a class today in the Osho Lifelong Learning Institute course that I teach on climate change and stuff. where I was referring to the work that you've been doing, Susan, and I was thinking about the fact that you were getting results at the higher elevations, which was sort of counterintuitive.
Mhm.
And I wondered if I can't recall what the elevations were of what you were calling higher elevations, but I wondered if there might have been an influence that results from the fact that we're finding precipitation that we were getting at high elevations as snow is falling at lower elevations as rain. And I was wondering if your higher elevations might have been in that transition zone where they would get the precipitation, instead of going at high elevations as snow, was falling at lower elevations as rain. And that might have been making moist communities.
Yeah, I'm not aware that it has, where the precipitation falls has changed, but I do think that at high elevations, more precipitation is falling as rain rather than snow. And if it does fall as snow, it doesn't hang around as long. And so you do see that decline in snowpack, which is, significant in multiple ways, because when the snowpack is sitting there, it determines when the growing season is going to start. But then as it melts and the growing season starts, the snowpack sort of determines how long the growing season is going to last, because it determines the water supply. So if you warm up those, so the snowpack elevations would be from about 5,000 feet upwards, let's say. I mean, mountain hemlock and red fir are pretty much like trees that are found in a historically snowpack environment. So they're pretty good markers, I think, for this. And so there's less snowpack. Initially, that's going to mean that maybe the season starts a little earlier. It could also mean that there's more degree days during the growing season. Plants might grow more vigorously. It also could end up meaning, over time especially, it could mean that the season ends earlier because the soil is going to dry out earlier. So there's going to be this mixture of effects. But here's another thing that's going on. And your question allows me to take a little digression into something that I skipped over. I had mentioned that we were at pains to make sure we were thinking of other things going on besides just climate change. And so we got hold of some historical and modern aerial photos of the forest in this region, because we wanted to know what had happened with sort of like the whole forest fire suppression and stand densification story, which a lot of people had told us was going to be really important. With fire suppression, forests have gotten denser and shadier, and that has had a big impact on understory communities. So we were well prepared to see that in our data, and it didn't seem like we were seeing it. So we got hold of these aerial photos, and one thing we found was that only at high elevations the amount of forest cover has increased. So it's at those elevations where, imagine you're up on Lake Mountain or Mount Elijah behind Caves Monument, and you've got forest stands and you've got big meadows in between them. As the climate's gotten warmer, those meadows are filling in. You get small trees moving into the meadows, and maybe there's also densification within the stands. But what I'm told is that a lot of the densification is the filling in of those gaps. And so at high elevations, you're actually getting a shadier environment due to, and this could be the effect. This is putatively, it's not an effect of fire suppression, because high elevations are not where the fire suppression story has played out. But high elevations are where tree growth is most limited by temperature. And this is something people are seeing throughout the world, is the upward advance of tree line and just general increasing greenness, increasing forestedness of high, cold, snowy elevation habitats. So I think we're seeing a little bit of that in our high elevation data, which could account for this anomalous thing that we saw, that the species of northerly biogeographic origin actually increased a bit in our high elevation sites. Because hey, it's better for them now. They got a longer, nicer growing season, and it's nice and shady, and that's what they like. My general strategy with a question is just keep digressing until I forget what the question was, and hopefully somewhere in there I answered it.
Well, and for those who now have been triggered with additional questions, Susan has agreed to stay, and I will go through the things that about SOCAN and other groups, and then we'll stop the recording and take questions that some of you may have. So we would like to again thank the Siskiyous chapter for helping us with this idea and with this presentation. What this is showing you how to get to the part if you want to look at any of the research, and we also have some ideas for action. So if you go to socan.eco/action, it'll take you to this page, and there are 2 columns. So you pick collective action, and then you go down till you see the natural resources heading, and then the forest understory plant communities. And that's where the details will be if you want any of that information. So what I'm going to share now are events, and I'll do that quickly. So if you miss a detail that you're interested in, if you go to socan.eco/events and click on the calendar for that date, you'll find out the details. So SOCAN has 5 different programs, and then we have projects under those programs. So under the government program, we have the County City Project, and that main project group will meet on Thursday, October 27th. This will be a Zoom meeting, and the details for that are on the calendar. That project has some action teams, and the Medford action team will meet on November 4th. That's a Zoom meeting. The Jacksonville action team will meet on November 14th, and that's an in-person meeting at the library in Jacksonville. Also under the government program is the federal and state project, and that group will meet on Monday, November 14th. That is a Zoom meeting. That group was responsible for the candidate forums that some people on this Zoom meeting attended and some organized. So what we've done are the 2 different dates. Each of those has a video that the one for the October 4th is linked, and the one for the October 18th we expect will be linked tomorrow if you're interested in seeing the candidates responding to questions on climate and the environment. Under the Natural Resources Program, the Forest and Fire Project will meet on Wednesday, November 16th, and that is a Zoom meeting. Under the Education Program, SOCAN's Master Climate Protector is getting ready for February. This is a 10-week course, and we are planning to do this in person again at the Higher Education Center in Medford. So if you are interested in 10 weeks of learning more about climate change and actions that can be taken, go to the website about the Master Climate Protector. And if you have any questions, you can email ellie@socan.eco. Also under community engagement, we have a group on the coast. The Coastal SOCAN group will meet this week, tomorrow, at 5:30, and they're going to do a hybrid, so at the library and also on Zoom. SOCAN at Mountain Meadows is going to meet on November 1st, and that's an in-person meeting. And the Sustaining Climate Activists, which is a support group for people working on the very stressful issues of climate change, that will change to a Zoom meeting for November 19th, and the details are on the calendar. Our next monthly meeting, always the last Tuesday of the month, will be November 29th at 6 p.m. And what we're going to talk about is election 2022. Now what? Looking ahead as we look at the results of the election, and that will be a Zoom meeting. So there are other projects that just don't have meetings, and these are all on the website with the contact people. If you're interested in any of these areas, I encourage you to send an email. And at the end, I'll give you the general email for SOCAN. You can always send a message there, and we'll get it to the right person. There are some other groups who are doing things related to climate change. Southern Oregon Pachamama Alliance Community is having the Rogue Valley Water Solutions Summit. And tomorrow will be the 4th of their 6 conversations. And if you go to SOCAN's Facebook, there's a link there to the Water Summit. Southern Oregon Land Conservancy is having a stewardship day at Rogue River Preserve. And this is an idea for action. If you want to take action on plants in our area, they encourage you to join them for this event. And the details of this are on the landconserve.org/calendar. Climate Reality, Portland chapter is having a program on November 15th. It's South Coast Offshore Wind Effort, and that is Zoom, and they've invited us to join them for that meeting. ROCPAC is Rural Oregon Climate Political Action Committee, and that group is going to start getting things organized as the legislature works towards its beginning for 2023. Also, Rogue Valley Voice is an ecumenical, offers an ecumenical perspective, and they have on their website different events that you might be interested in. So I would like to offer our thanks to Susan for sharing this wealth of information and all these years of work. Just very interesting to know that's going on in our backyard, basically. Thanks to Christy and Alan for putting the plan together and making this all possible, and to the Siskiyous chapter of the Oregon Native Plant Society for co-sponsoring. And thanks to all of you for joining us. And this only works if we take action. So my plea for action, first of all, vote. Very important, vote for climate conscious candidates up and down the ballot. So we don't endorse candidates, but we can sure encourage you to vote for people who understand climate change issues and are willing to take action. And then again, the links for tonight's program are at socan.eco/action, then collective action, natural resources. Finally, a link was sent to you in a follow-up email about 6:30, and there's a survey. We really appreciate your feedback to the survey. It shouldn't take you more than just a couple minutes. SOCAN website is socan.eco. If you have any questions that aren't answered, info@socan.eco. And if it's within the possibilities that you have available to you, if you consider a donation to SOCAN, that's how we survive. So with that, we will